The sex worker doesn't really want to be in the hotel. They're only doing it because they're receiving money. And the final point I want to make is he likes to create this impression of being a hard man, but he's a hard man who changes his mind. But one very interesting calculation I've seen is that basically a good marriage is worth about £100,000 a year. Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant doctor and psychiatrist, and I work in private practice in Harley Street, London, in the United Kingdom. So welcome. Today, I want to talk a little bit about tariffs, because it's kind of like in the news a lot. Now, before you switch off, because you may think that's a very boring subject, even though it's in the news and is important and seems to matter to all of us, I'm going to say a few challenging and controversial things, and I'm interested in your comments below. One of the points I'm going to make is tariffs seem a somewhat abstruse and slightly remote subject from everyday life, but that's only because of the way you tend to think about your life. And I'm going to argue that, in fact, although you go to a marketplace and you see trading occurring, or you think of trading as occurring when currency dealers are trading currency or stocks, etc., I'm going to argue that practically everything you do, indeed everything you do in your life, is a trade of some description. Even when you're alone in a room, you might be trading with yourself. So I'm going to argue that maybe something that's changing hands isn't money, sometimes in intimate relationships, but maybe feelings are changing hands. So maybe if everything is a trade, we can begin to think about our lives more effectively and become more effective and have better well-being if we think about it in what may appear a somewhat clinical way, but it's a different way of thinking about our lives and could be quite powerful. And the general theme of all these videos is an attempt to help people improve their lives, become more resilient, have better well-being, so that you don't need to come and see someone like me, that you don't need to come and see a psychiatrist, basically. So the other thing I'm going to talk a bit about is this puzzle about why in the media you will hear economist after economist, professional economists, say that tariffs are a bad idea. They're all against tariffs. All economists through history, generally speaking, except for one or two very minor and small examples, have been against tariffs. They've been pro-free trade. Why is that? And why is it the public, by and large, seem much more supportive of tariffs? Why did Donald Trump get elected on a platform where he was hinting very heavily tariffs were coming down the line? So why is it tariffs appear popular, but then frequently, and economists are against them, it turns out to be a bit of a disaster? So what's going on psychologically there? I'm going to talk a little bit more in a pragmatic and hopefully understandable way about tariffs and what's really going on with tariffs. And finally, I want to talk a bit about what tariffs reveal about Donald Trump's psychology, because I think that's very interesting. And I think people fundamentally are perplexed about what's going on because Donald Trump seems to be changing his mind almost on a daily or even, you could say, hour by hour basis on the tariff front. And I'm also going to discuss the psychology of negotiation, because he's the author of this book, The Art of the Deal. He thinks he's a great deal maker, but this kind of flip-flopping over tariffs, is this really the sign of a great deal maker, or something else going on? So let's just start with the fact that my very bold assertion is that everything you do, even with friends, outside of the world of work or buying or selling stuff, everything is a trade. So what do I mean by that? What I'm arguing here is that everything that you do which involves other people must be a trade of some description, because basically what you're trying to do, if you're an effective human being, is supply something. It doesn't have to be a product. It could be your attention, your interest, your love. You're supplying something to someone else, and you're hoping to get something back. Again, in your intimate personal life with friends or lovers, it could be an emotion. So maybe always there's an emotional trade of some description going on. Now, apologies for the fact we're going to leap into a very gory example straight away. Many people can see straight away that when they think about someone, a businessman, let's say, at a conference. I won't reveal as a psychiatrist consulted by many businessmen why I picked that as a scenario, who pays for a sex worker to have a sex act performed on them that evening. We can see there's a trade going on there. The sex worker doesn't really want to be in the hotel. They're only doing it because they're receiving money. And the business person is getting a transaction, getting something in exchange. We see that quite clearly as a trade of some description. What we would say is when boyfriend and girlfriend are together and performing a sex act on each other of some description or an intimate act, we would say that's not a trade. That's not a trade in the same way. Well, let's think about that a bit more carefully. Is something not being transacted? Even if it's not money, is a feeling of some description being transacted? Is there an exchange of some kind going on? When a couple decide that one person's going to go out and work and the other person stays at home and is a homemaker, is a trade not going on there of some description? Is the homemaker not providing the security of a home and that the person who goes out and earns money brings home money and is providing something in exchange? Is everything a trade of some description? You may have friends that you like to go out with, and those friends may not have a job, may not have much money, and therefore you rather generously tend to pay for them a bit more than you might do if they had a job and money. You're generous with them. Is there not a sense in which a trade is going on? They are, an economist would say, time rich and resource poor. So they can offer you their time, and they don't have much money, but you have money, but you're time poor. You give them money in the sense you're generous over buying the drinks and don't expect them to be quite equal to you when it comes to the restaurant bill. Is there not a trade of some description going on there? One of the reasons why this is a very interesting and powerful way of thinking about life, though some people may say somewhat clinical, somewhat scientific, somewhat Machiavellian, somewhat a monetary sense of thinking about life, is this different perspective can actually, in taking out the emotion of life, make you more powerful. Let's take an example. Economists have calculated what the yearly or annual value of a marriage is. So you might find that a slightly puzzling idea. But what they've done is they've calculated what it would cost you, and we can forget the word marriage here, just take a long-term committed relationship of some kind, what it would cost you instead of being married to someone if you went into the marketplace and bought all the services that you get from a marriage. The sexual services, the psychotherapeutic services, the nanny services, the housekeeping services, etc., etc. And it's a nice thing to actually, and it's a game to play, to ask your current partner what they think a relationship is worth in a monetary sense, or a marriage is worth on an annual basis. Now, the numbers vary depending on the country and the time that the calculation is done. But one very interesting calculation I've seen is that basically a good marriage is worth about £100,000 a year, or roughly speaking, the ballpark figure, roughly $100,000. So what did you think it was worth? Did you think it was worth a lot less? In which case, does that tell us something about the relationship you're in? Or did you think it was worth a lot more than that? Very few people think of a marriage as being worth that much. And I do a lot of marital therapy in Harley Street, and I find telling people that a good marriage is worth about £100,000 a year makes them pay a lot more attention to the marriage. I point out that a Bentley, maybe not a brand new Bentley these days, but a Bentley costs about £100,000. And if you had a Bentley in the garage, wouldn't you look after it? Wouldn't you go out and polish it every evening and get it regularly serviced, etc., etc.? So maybe you should look after your marriage in the same way as you might look after a Bentley. Sorry, I'm into classic cars, so there are many kind of car analogies that you will have to endure in these videos. So, thinking about everything in life as a trade helps you to be more effective, because you become aware of what's being traded, and maybe you can get more of what you want in life by being able to supply more of what you want. Some people would say this is an argument against pure altruism, that some people are generous and give to charity and give to people around them and don't expect anything in return, and that's pure altruism. Well, some people would say you are getting something in return. You're getting a feeling of moral superiority. You're getting a feeling that you're a great person because you do stuff for free. So again, there's an idea here that something is always being traded. So Moving on now, if you understand that everything is a trade, it's important to understand why economists now are against tariffs, because tariffs are basically a restriction on trade of some description. They're anti-competitive. You put up the price of a product, and it therefore means that the product is more expensive, and it means locally produced products can compete a bit better, which are produced in a more expensive way than the cheaper foreign product. So tariffs are unhelpful to the average consumer because it constrains choice, and it's a bit ironic that the United States of America, the home of the free market, the home of the idea of choice and competition, is actually pulling up the drawbridge on the rest of the world and kind of has a deglobalization agenda. So economists are against tariffs because they tend to create inflation. They make things more expensive than they otherwise would be. You could buy cheaper trainers from China, but if you hike up the price of trainers coming across the border from China, then by definition, trainers are more expensive, and you're left, if China refuses now to sell trainers in the US because they're too expensive, with local trainers, which by definition were more expensive. That's why the foreign-made trainers were cheaper and were taking over the market to some extent. So one of the reasons why Milton Friedman, a very famous economist, and his videos are available free on YouTube, and I would certainly recommend them. One of the reasons he says people don't understand tariffs and tend to be ordinary people, pro-tariffs, is he says that when you are trading in your life, and we're going back to a point now that everything is a trade, you trade your employment, you trade your labor, and you get paid for that. And you tend to know a lot about that and the value of your labor because it's the one thing that you're trading whereby you get an income. However, everything else in your life, in terms of the fact that you buy stuff, you might buy 1,000 products. You only have the one job, but you buy 1,000 products. So you become less aware of the fact that the cost of those products is going up, or the cost of them is determined by the fact there may be tariffs somewhere. You tend to be pro-tariffs because you tend to think that a tariff may protect your job. Economists say it doesn't really protect your job because if you have free trade, other countries will produce things cheaper than you, but you as a country have what economists call a comparative advantage. And it's the comparative advantage that helps free trade occur and leads to more efficiency and cheaper products all round. Milton Friedman gives a nice example of this. He says that his lawyer is also actually a better typist than the secretary who types for the lawyer. The lawyer is good at law and also good at typing and is a better typist than his secretary who does the typing. Milton Friedman says despite the fact the lawyer is a better typist than his own typist, it makes no sense from an economic standpoint for his lawyer to do all his own typing. It makes more sense that the lawyer spends his time doing law, where he has a comparative advantage and makes much more money than if he devotes himself to typing. So the power of comparative advantage in a globalized economy is let the countries who can figure out how to do something the best way and the cheapest way, let them do it. And let us benefit from the cheap, effective way they do those products. Let us have free choice and let us, because we'll have a comparative advantage over them in some places, let us do what we do best, and the whole global economy will work better as a result. I have an interesting example of this comparative advantage that the United States seems to be a bit blind to, and that is Hollywood. Hollywood produces a product, American films, and there are very few other countries that can compete with Hollywood. I was on a German plane, a German airline recently, flying from Frankfurt to Miami, and the airline was German, and the steward was German, and he was making the announcement in German, and it turned out he made a joke, and the joke was something to do, we heard later, about the fact that he looks a bit like Bruce Willis, okay, but he said it all in German because the airline was full of German people. We were the only non-Germans on the plane, and everyone laughed. And it was interesting that everyone laughed because everyone recognized immediately who Bruce Willis was, right? So there was the power there of the advantage of Hollywood over the rest of let's say, the German film industry. I doubt a British Airways flight steward could make a comment mentioning a German actor and that the airline would laugh. We wouldn't know. Can anyone name a German actor? No, but we can name Hollywood actors. It tells you something about the power of the comparative advantage of Hollywood over industries around the world. So the other reason why, psychologically speaking, some people seem to be in favor of tariffs when it doesn't make actually financial and economic sense, is people who make stuff and then discover the stuff they make is a bit more expensive than foreign competition, always come up with a slightly paranoid conspiracy theory that the reason the other side are making the product better than I or cheaper than me is because they're cheating in some way. That's generally a natural human tendency to see cheating elsewhere in the world compared to what you're doing. So a couple of other points I want to make about the power of tariffs and the why you should pay attention to them, and to think a little bit about the economic disadvantages, is India and China, two of the biggest countries in the world in terms of population, are so big, both have over 1 billion people, there's a sense in which they don't need really to trade with the rest of the world. And that was their policy up until about 30 years ago. That was the policy of Mao Zedong in China, that we won't bother trading with the rest of the world, we'll just trade with ourselves. And it was only when both countries opened up their economies to the rest of the world that their economies took off. And that is the power of free trade and the power of choice and letting consumers choose. So a couple of other quick points I want to make. The tech bros, the billionaires that were with Trump at his inauguration, the head of Apple and the head of Tesla, for example, the irony is all the billionaires that support Trump, they all made their money from companies that outsourced stuff, product, services to China. iPhones are made in China. So Apple's taking a big hit with tariffs. And Tesla, there's some controversy about how many of the components in a Tesla car come from America, how many come from abroad. So the irony is the billionaires that back Trump themselves made their money how? They made it through free trade. They made it through sending jobs abroad, not having jobs in the USA. Okay, so the final point I want to make is about Trump and tariffs. So Trump sees himself as a great deal maker, and he believes that having tariffs so high is going to create a great deal. But the problem is he's flip-flopping over tariffs. One day they're high, the next day they're lower, the next day they're high again, etc., etc. I want you to imagine you want to buy a car. You go to a car dealer, and the car dealer says, oh, today the car is £20,000. And then you say, I've got to think about it. You come back the next day, and the dealer says the car is now £30,000. They decided to raise the price. Okay. Then the next day, the car is £15,000. Would you buy a car from that dealer, or would you bide your time waiting for the lowest price? And in doing that, do you stop trading with a dealer? Do you pause the trade? Or do you go and find a dealer who you think is a bit less flaky? Trump created his reputation as a property dealer. And when you deal in property, it doesn't matter if you flip-flop, because you move on to the next property deal and you're dealing with another customer. So this idea that countries trade with each other and will trade with each other for the next 1,000 years, and they've been trading for the last 1,000 years, means you've got to be careful about reputational damage. Okay, you can make a great deal today, but if the other person is going to go off you because of that deal and doesn't want to trade with you again tomorrow, then you being a great deal maker is neither here nor there, because reputational damage, the long-term influence of trading over a long term, which is not what Trump is used to. Trump is used to, let's say, perhaps shafting one customer today and then moving on to another customer tomorrow. That's how property deals work. So this notion of a long-term relationship is not something he's used to. And therefore, one of the things that's really of concern is this flip-flopping doesn't take account psychologically of a deep aspect of world trade that maybe he's not experienced about. And the final point I want to make is he likes to create this impression of being a hard man, but he's a hard man who changes his mind. To what extent do you think you can create a reputation or an impression of being a hard man if you also create the reputation of someone who changes his mind all the time? So if you begin to understand how trades work and the impact of the way Trump is doing trades, I believe you can think about your life in a more effective, better way. And if you think about everything you do in life as a trade, I believe you can learn a key point, which is how to trade more effectively in your life, in everything that you do. And that requires you to think hard about what it is you need to supply to other people to get what you want. And that is the essence of an effective life. Thank you very much indeed.